So my name's Linda Amran Cooper, and it's a warm welcome to everybody here on the call, on the Zoom. Lovely to see lots and lots of people here for a topic that I know is in everybody's mind all the time. If you're working in higher education, then academic integrity is a big deal for all of us. So I'm Linda Amran Cooper. I'm Director of the Centre for Online and Distance Education at the University of London. And I'm delighted to have this webinar, which is the last of our webinars in this UK academic year. And we have had a series of webinars looking at aspects of assessment in the widest range. We've had a look at AI and assessment. We're looking today at academic assessment. We've had other activities. I don't think there has been a topic that has been as hot as academic integrity, because it comes straight out of questions around AI. So the University of London itself, as people may know, has a large number of students in 190 countries who are studying online, blended and distance with us. And as a result of that, over the last few years, the university has had to experiment, engage with, evaluate, research, and spend quite a lot of time thinking about how do we effectively provide opportunities for students to demonstrate their own subject expertise, their knowledge, their understanding, their skills. And we've been through, I think, like the whole sector, a whole range of experiences, initially driven by COVID and more recently driven by AI, where we're looking at ways where authentic assessment can become more meaningful, can become more employer relevant, can become more trustworthy, perhaps. And so this project, which has been undertaken by a team who I'm going to introduce you to in a moment, a Code Fellows team. This project has really looked at these issues of academic integrity, so I'm really pleased to have the team with us. The work really builds out of 5 or 6 years of work that the centre has been doing in evaluating online timed assessments, particularly for our distributed student populations. And we've got some really interesting findings out of there, and we've charted the journey of online assessment, which I think many colleagues on the call will have been involved with in their own institutions, and as teachers and educators and as students. So I'm going to hand over now, if I may, to Professor Alan Tait and Professor Stylianos Hatzipanagos, and invite them to talk to us about the project that they undertook and particularly the findings. I will put in the chat the link to the report from the findings, which is on the UOL Code website. Just to remind you that the event is being recorded, and we will provide a link to the YouTube channel with the video from this session, and a colleague of ours also writes a detailed report which will be available in a few weeks. We'll provide all that information to you. We invite you to put comments, questions, reflections in the chat if you'd like to, and we're open to as much dialogue as we can possibly fit in the next 55 minutes. Thank you very much. Over to you, Stylianos, I think.
Hello everybody. I'm not saying good morning or good afternoon, good evening, because I bet we have quite a range of geographical locations. Thank you for joining this workshop, this interactive webinar. And I will start by sharing my screen. If you give me a minute. Are you able to see my screen? Yeah?
Yes, we can see your screen. You just need to put it into
presentation mode, yeah?
Presentation mode, that's it. So
is everything okay now? Everybody can see my screen?
It looks to me to be zoomed in at the moment.
Okay.
I don't know if that's the same for everyone.
Right, okay. I'm stop sharing and I'm starting again to get this right. Apologies.
Do you want me to share the slides, Stylianos?
Yes, that would be great, Linda,
Yeah.
if you could.
I'll do that.
Great, thank you. So, this is as Linda mentioned, this is a project that has been funded by the Centre for Online and Distance Education at the University of London. And I have with me Alan Tait. Alan and I will be doing this presentation. Steve, I've seen him in the audience, will be joining us during the discussion as well. So there was a team of code fellows that were behind this project. And as I mentioned, in addition to Alan and me, it was Michele Milner and Steve Warburton. So Linda, could you move to the next slide? So what's the agenda for the webinar? I will talk briefly about the background and purpose for this project, the methodology and the scope. I'll give you some literature insights because literature says what research says about academic integrity was a big initiative for us. It was absolutely necessary to gauge the literature and research taking place around academic integrity in the beginning of the project. Then we are going to talk about the stakeholder perspectives, go through the key findings. There is a particular section about challenges of AI. However, this is a broader webinar around the notion of academic integrity rather than focusing exclusively on the intricacies of AI in relation to academic integrity, and to have some recommendations and a question and answer section in the end. Yep. Linda, could you please move to the next slide? So the background, the purpose had to do with the rise in misconduct post-COVID. So everybody recognizes this. The COVID created an interesting landscape in higher education, particularly the first year where institutions were not prepared. Quite a lot of institutions, I must say, to be correct, were not prepared in relation to transition from face-to-face to online. Either it was temporary or for good. This affected distance learning providers as well, because quite a lot of distance learning providers had assessments that were face-to-face. A good example of that, very relevant to the University of London, had to do with exams taking place in exam centers using pen and paper. And quite a lot of institutions had to move abruptly into the new paradigm of running assessments online. So the consequence of that had to do with a rise in misconduct post-COVID and a big hit in relation to academic integrity. So there was a reaction from the sector, and the reaction had to do with intense focus on online learning vulnerabilities. The transition to online showcased some of the extreme vulnerabilities of the system in relation to assessment and in relation to academic integrity. So the area where we're interested in is we felt the need to talk to our stakeholders, and I will explain briefly who the stakeholders were, to talk about evidence-based strategies around dealing with this issue, with this situation where academic integrity was a key risk in how institutions were managing their assessment activities. Linda, could you please move to the next slide? So the project objectives had to do, first of all, to identify current strategies to support academic integrity, promote innovative assessment design, and support policy and training. So we looked at these three key objectives, and this was the three key objectives of the project. Next, please. So methodology-wise, there was a literature review. There were 14 stakeholder interviews, substantial interviews. The stakeholders were academics, both from distant learning and other institutions that had a hybrid delivery, to put it this way. Administrators. By administrators, I mean not just administrative staff that had a role in relation to academic integrity, but also senior managers that were responsible in this particular area. I had quite a lot of knowledge about how assessment was managed at their institution. So it was a combination of administrative staff with responsibility in academic conduct, and also technical providers. We talked to some technical providers because we wanted to get an idea how technical providers were dealing with the issue of academic integrity and what were the response to putting together tools that would help institutions to manage challenges around academic integrity. So the collected data went through a thematic analysis. We identified key themes. We wrote up the report. The report is available on the website, and Linda in a minute will provide the link. I need to mention that we used AI for triangulation, not as a primary analysis tool. So I did not use AI to identify themes, but we used AI as a triangulation tool to identify whether there were any particular areas that we had neglected. I need to say that before we start into the literature review outcomes, that it was slightly disappointing because what we got out of the AI treatment of our data were not particularly exciting, not particularly innovative, not particularly showing something that we had ignored and neglected in our thematic analysis. But I think it was a good approach methodologically. Linda, next slide, please. So, literature review highlights. I will give you a taste of what the literature review was about. There were 4 key pillars of the literature review. Had to do with institutional, design, regulatory, and technology. So the institutional aspect was looked at how different institutions, according to published outcomes to publications, dealt with academic integrity. It had to do with design, how assessment design was used to deal with issues related to academic misconduct. There was a regulatory aspect we were interested in, and we'll talk about that in detail a bit later, because we had a great interest in how institutions provided the regulatory frameworks to support academic integrity. And we have quite a lot of strong views about that. And technology had to do tools that were in place, and we'll talk about the types of tools that were in place to support academic integrity. We looked also at factors that had to do with our students, the students out there that were studying either in a distant learning or in a hybrid or in a face-to-face content. And there were some key areas there, we thought. One was about environmental aspects, and the other was about individual. I will explain briefly what I mean about with environmental factors. So environmental factors had to do with assessment methodology. What was the particular assessment of the students, methodology of the student, that assessment format the students engaged with, the time frame, particularly in the beginning and a bit later as well, time frame, i.e. the time used for the students to respond to a question as set by the institution was a key component, and it had a particular impact on how students dealt with assessment online. So either they had half an hour or 24 hours in order to complete an assessment, played quite an important role, and it was a key environmental factor of how a particular assessment was responded to. Also, another aspect that was quite important was what we call implementation or assessment for learning. So whether any systems allowed this much desired, quite elusive assessment for learning. And it was evident in how assessment was set up. In relation to individual factors, it had to do with what the word says, individual factors as far as the students are concerned, age, type of transition to HE, route of transition to HE, nationality and language. Nationality played quite an important role, and also language. And nationality was a cultural, quite often connoted a cultural aspect, because students may be coming from a culture where their attitudes to assessment were in a particular directions. Language may be a factor that impeded the students' wish to do well in assessment because of lack of language proficiency. There were other aspects like the intellectual ability, any perceived inadequacies the students had about how well or how badly they could do. So, and also something which was a social pressure. Technology had to do with plagiarism detection and tools that the universities had in place, for instance, online proctoring, some services that embraced the assessment systems. For instance, some institutions had assessment platforms or set up assessment platforms in response to the issues that COVID and later on AI brought to the fore by creating assessment platforms that dealt with assessment design, with making sure that institutional assessments were supported by the systems in place. The third aspect of the literature review had to do with the importance of proactive design and education. So he looked at aspects of this in the literature, whether, and that was an outcome that quite a lot of the literature, quite often not drawing from substantive practice, quite often in an experimental fashion, talking about proactive design and pedagogical approaches. Linda, could you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is I will give you a generic overview of the stakeholder voices before I pass on to Alan, who will look further in depth in the findings of this investigation. So the overall review was, as you would expect, there were varied approaches on how our stakeholders approach the issue of academic integrity. This had to do quite often with their role. You have, for instance, the technical providers have as expected, a more kind of technology-oriented approach in dealing with academic conduct. We'll talk about that in a bit. And overall, there was at the core of this approaches to academic integrity, there was this contradiction, an element of trust for students versus surveillance. So what came across from these stakeholder voices quite often was that surveillance in most universities was at the core of academic integrity, and quite often drove quite a lot of the institutional initiatives in academic conduct. So he looked at that, and he looked as well on the perception of academic integrity and the shift to online formats. So there was an overall shift to online formats, and the third component of the stakeholder voices had to do with emphasis on assessment redesign. So this was a key theme that came up quite a lot of times in our data, and the assessment redesign had to do with a radical review of assessment practice to ensure that academic integrity is respected, and that was a key thing in our stakeholder voices. Linda, could you please move on to the next slide? So, as far as the academics that we interviewed, the shift to online formats was a key component, a key consideration, a key theme on what they talked about. It was particularly for distant learning institutions, there was a big step because, as mentioned, institutions had to react fast, and they had to redesign their assessments. They had to provide different assessment frameworks in response to the challenges that COVID and a bit later AI brought to the field. Overall, our academics, the academics who talk, express this desire for trust-based system. So that this trust had to do with trust towards our students, and this was contradicted. This was put against, to put it this way, this surveillance culture that existed in quite a lot of institutions. So some of the academics we talked to expressed the desire for trust in our students that would be at the fore of what institutions should be trying to do. Also, the academics expressed a desire for authentic assessment, and they had the opportunity to explain what they meant by that, what authentic assessment meant in their context. Quite often it had to do with how assessment in a particular discipline was reinterpreted. It had to do with the students dealing with, for instance, projects that were very relevant to what they were doing when they moved to a professional situation after graduation. It had to do with sometimes with employers preferences in relation to what the curriculum should be about. I don't think it created any big chasm between what the employers wanted and what the university were willing to offer, but there were some challenges there in this authentic assessment debate, because quite often regulatory frameworks, regulatory bodies were against any innovation of this type, because they had particular views on how they would able to accredit degrees and assessment frameworks. So there was a bit of a challenge there. Linda, could you please move on to the next slide? So, as I said, we talked to administrators, and these administrators were people that had a significant role as far as assessment is concerned in their institution, and also some of these administrative staff were senior managers in the institution they worked in. These stakeholders focus quite a lot about similarity and collusion issues. They worry about how similarity, what the implication of similarity in students' work and collusion meant for the risks for academic integrity. I will explain what I mean by that. In particular, these stakeholders talked about collusion as far as we know, collusion had to do with a third party which is involved in the phase where a student takes a particular assessment. The worry was not so much about external bodies, companies that whose job was whose business was this particular aspect. They were mostly worried about collusion between the students. So somebody mentioned an example of a few students sitting around a table taking together an exam, an open book exam in a particular topic, law or something like that. So the issue of similarity as far as sharing notes came up quite a lot, and the issue of impersonation was discussed in this particular context. AI came up as a key component there, and of course the struggles and the challenges with AI detection, how you do that. At the stage where we talked to our stakeholders, there was not a great selection of tools to help academics deal with or institutions to deal with AI detection. For instance, to give you an example, and if I may mention a particular tool, Tait had a plugin. Quite a lot of our stakeholders didn't think that the Tait plugin was at that stage when we talked to them great or very helpful in identifying AI issues in students' work. The third kind of aspect that was very important, and later on we'll talk about that again, had to do with policies. So it was unanimous in how these administrators were very keen to see updated policies on assessment that would deal with how academic integrity should be dealt with, particularly in the context of artificial intelligence. And we can understand why this was the case, because it was a very uncertain landscape, and quite often institutions were a bit slow in responding or putting in place good comprehensive policies to support the use of AI in higher education. For obvious reasons, because it was a very changing landscape, We'll see some of the challenges there. For instance, the lack of student involvement. Linda, could we move to the next slide? So, as far as the technology provider insights, we had an interviews with 2 senior managers of digital assessment platforms, and the idea is to gather their understanding of major issues affecting online assessment. Both acknowledged that academic misconduct had increased in some programs and some institutions, but not in all. In some places, assessment design had mitigated the risks from conduct cheating in particular. So assessment redesign, they thought, was at the core of this problem. The most important thing, according to these technical providers, was to take a holistic view of academic misconduct and to look at it from the educational perspective. Particularly one of them was adamant that it was not the provision of a sophisticated piece of software that would deal with detection, but had to do with something like that, with a technological tool, however, that should be used in combination with assessment redesign. So there was a push for holistic prevention of strategies, and that's what I meant when I said that they looked for something that could be optimal in combining technology, but also a good redesign of assessment by a particular institution. So there was support for design, education, and technological support in order for students and staff to deal with the challenges of the new environment. We are moving on to the findings section. Linda, could you please move on? Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stylianos, and hello, everybody. Let me just put my video on. I had a dead screen problem, so it caused me something of a panic. So these slides now are summary slides for the work that Stylianos has given in more detail. First of all, there's a widespread understanding that post-COVID, there has been a growth in academic misconduct. So we'll have to look at a 5-year period. The first year after the COVID emergency, 2020, there was a sharp rise in academic misconduct. There was widespread grade inflation, a widespread number of academic offences. That was controlled to a greater or lesser extent in the second and third years of the COVID period. But like all crises, some people reacted by saying, as soon as this is over, we want to go back to the world as it was, while others said, this crisis has made us think about what we do and how we do it, and the future is going to be different than the past. Nobody, of course, foresaw at that stage, or at least very few people foresaw at that stage, the impact AI was going to have in 2023. There's a widespread view, however, that while academic misconduct in the context of AI is certainly a problem, nobody can pretend it isn't, and nobody can say we know enough about its use yet to manage academic misconduct. Detection is not an adequate response. There are those who think that this is really about policing, and policing will solve this problem. But there's a much wider view, and it's a view that I think that Stylianos and I and others would endorse, that detection is not an adequate response. There was a view early in 2023 from some colleagues that the solution to the challenges of AI in education was to stop our students using it. That view soon gave way, I think, in a matter of 3 or 4 months, to the near universal view now that we have to understand and use AI, and our students have to understand and use AI because it's part of their personal and professional lives. And indeed, we know that, I think if I remember correctly, 80% of students are already using AI. So AI is there everybody is using it, nearly everybody is using it. So detection is not an adequate response. And to go on to the third part of this slide, we have to keep working at student awareness of how to use AI and professional awareness, academics and professional staff, for many of whom this is as big a challenge as the digital revolution was 40 years ago. I mean, this is a world-changing set of technologies, and keeping up to date with it is a challenge for us all. I certainly can acknowledge that. And it's going to be a challenge for our students, but it's absolutely essential that we keep working on that. Our students need support. Most institutions now have policies for students about the use of AI in their field. There's a much less adequate response to the need to help our academics and our professional staff use and understand AI. And lastly, there's a widespread view, which we think is entirely healthy, that AI has meant we have to come again to the issue of redesigning assessment. That question was raised by the more insightful people as a result of the COVID crisis. What has the COVID crisis and the move to online assessment taught us about how assessment functions, what it's for, how we can use it most fruitfully? AI has certainly brought that lesson home very, very sharply indeed. Next slide, Linda, please. So AI is a major disruption in assessment and is widely understood by the people we've been talking to be so. Firstly, and this is very much an unfinished story, generative AI reshapes authorship norms. In other words, it challenges the very notion of what academic integrity is. So it's always been a highly skilled job to explain to students how existing sources can be legitimately used and how illegitimate use leads to plagiarism. But AI reshapes what authorship means, whose work belongs to who. So it reshapes that, and that is an unfinished story. So that will continue to need very creative work to understand that. But of course, all that means that assessment has to adapt. So that response, that an early response to COVID, as soon as this is over, let's go back to the world as it was, is absolutely not inadequate as AI has entered the field of education and as well as everywhere else. You have to think about what we're assessing, how we're assessing, how assessment works, how we maintain academic integrity, and how we support learning. All of those questions are still very much open in the field, in the eyes of the people we've been talking to. And lastly, it means that AI literacy is one of the essential skills, not only for our academic and professional staff, but also to be built into the qualifications that our students leave our institutions with. It's an important literacy, as digital literacy has become over the last 30 years, and all the other range of literacies which we hope our students can learn with us. Linda, next slide, please. So, and it's some important insights here. There's a widespread reporting of a lag in policy updates. So while there is work going on to support students and staff in understanding AI and academic integrity, institutional policy is not keeping up to date. And of course, that leads to very, very difficult episodes when there are issues of academic misconduct and policy does not help us frame how we respond to those. So institutions need AI use guidance. That is significantly, but not universally, in place, but it's going to need constant attention and constant updating. But lastly, and not least, we found that student voices are often missing in the development of policy and regulation. The institutions are responding often with a sense of urgency, if not panic, as to how they update their policy and regulations, but they're not working with students as to what needs to be going on in those places. So student voices need to have a lot more attention paid to them as we develop academic integrity policy and regulation in the light of the advent of AI. And, next slide, please. So some thoughts from the people we've been talking to about assessment redesign. I think it's certainly the view of Stylianos and I, as well as Steve Warburton and Michele Milner, that assessment redesign lies at the heart of how we manage AI and assessment now and for the future. Authentic and real-world tasks are being increasingly looked at as a way of coping and improving our assessment practice, coping with AI, and in fact improving our assessment practice. They're less easily abused by AI support, although AI support is a perfectly legitimate use of that range of technologies in assessment tasks now. But authentic real-world tasks help us to ensure that the students are doing the work and that they're doing that work in contexts which mean something to them. Working with formative feedback during the teaching year is also so supplementing summative and final assessment with formative feedback, a widespread, but again, not a universal practice, but that helps to mitigate some of the threats from generative AI to academic integrity. And we found that colleagues were revisiting new and innovative assessment formats, for example, oral work and project-based work. But there are questions when you have very large-scale programs with, say, 5,000 students, as the University of London does have, as to how scalable that response and how sustainable that response is in terms of staff time. And I think we might have one more slide, Linda. Yes, so this is the last slide. So this, just to sum up, are the recommendations we believe come out of our project to institutions and to academic and professional colleagues. And you've seen we put right at the top of our list, partner with students. We believe the student voice has to be a partner, we have to work cooperatively with students. Taking up the issue of trust being at the core of our assessment practice, that came out strongly from a number of people we talked to, that we shouldn't work on the basis of only of policing, but also on the basis of building trust. So partnering with our students to develop a response, we think is key. We think redesigning assessment to improve it, to embed it in the real world, to mitigate the threat of academic misconduct is essential. Students have to be supported in understanding AI and the range of technologies that are represented and in developing the new literacies that they're going to need. Staff development, and we hesitate to say this at a time when academic and professional staff are so threatened by workload and time management, but we believe that staff development is absolutely core to supporting the quality use of AI in assessment for the future. And lastly, and obviously, but importantly, institutions need to update their policies, not just once, but regularly, so that those policies can actually support the practice that is going on in assessment and in managing academic misconduct where it arises. So that, Linda, brings us back to the end of the recommendations, and I think I hand over to you to manage some discussion out of the chat or elsewhere.
Thank you very much, Alan and Stylianos. Really stimulating. We've already got some questions in the chat. So I think what I will do is stop sharing, if that's okay. And I think we've got Stephen Warburton, who was also part of the project team, and I'm not sure if Michelle's here now as well. But perhaps I can pick up on some of the questions or comments that have been raised. So Matt raised the question about surveillance was at its core, and I think, Stylianos, this was while you were talking, and it was your exploration of what you were finding in the approaches that institutions and technology companies were taking. Matt's raised the question as in the need to have it or the desire to avoid it. So I think it was the need to have it, that there was a push to have surveillance tools available. Is that right, Alan or Stylianos? Stylianos, I think you might be on mute if you're responding.
I'm on mute, sorry. Apologies. Yeah.
Will we ever move beyond that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think when you talk to people, they felt that surveillance was at the core of how academic integrity was protected in their institutions. And they would need according to them, to move away from that, because on its own surveillance wouldn't be a good approach in dealing with protecting academic conduct in institutions. So there were suggestions and the desire to move away from that. And some others thought that probably realistically a combination of surveillance and trust in combination to assessment redesign would be the right approach to go for.
We did find examples of student pushback against surveillance. So, if you work with students as partners in how we develop our practices, that voice needs to be listened to as to what surveillance approaches are permissible, legitimate, acceptable, and which are not.
Alan is right. In another project, another investigation, which had to do with the longitudinal evaluation of assessment practices at the University of London, there was a big pushback from students in relation to surveillance. Students felt very, very much that there was privacy and confidentiality issues having to do with quite a lot of these tools that were put in place in order to protect academic integrity.
Thanks, Stylianos. So I think the sort of tools that were explored by the project team were use of platforms, assessment platforms, which included lockdown browsers and video and audio recording of the student while they were completing their online assessment. We also had some students who were assessed using human online proctoring, so a human watching the student from their computer using the webcam in the computer, and so on. So those are the type of surveillances, because that was one of the questions in the chat, asking about the type of surveillance.
What approaches, yeah.
And then of course we've also got the more traditional surveillance approach, which is an examination hall where people turn up to examination hall, sit at a desk, and there's an invigilator in the room. So we're also looking at the kind of return, and we've seen a lot of that happening, the return to examination halls, where people are observed completing their assessment as a way of potentially supporting academic integrity. There are quite a lot of questions that are asking about approaches taken in redesign assessment, particularly when we're talking about large scale. So I don't know if Steve, Michele, Alan or Stylianos want to, so there's a few questions here about assessment redesign that were thought to be particularly effective. So that's the gist of those questions, I think. So what, Steve or Michele, did you want to come in?
I can give a quick one. So the proctoring question was really interesting because privacy is a big issue. But in terms of redesign, the one that we've been piloting recently at Newcastle in Australia has been interactive oral assessment. So we've been looking for a design which allows us to have that validation of the student identity, but also allows us a less anxiety-provoking kind of mechanism than potentially what we'd see as a kind of PhD kind of format of a Viva. So we've been very careful to pitch it as one which is more conversational assessment. It is scalable. So the interactive oral assessments, I'll put the link in the chat, are scalable. So we've got up to being able to run those with around 300 students in our undergraduate psychology courses. The advantage is you do your interactive oral assessment, you have your rubric, you can immediately mark the student and you're done. So quite efficient.
So in terms of workload, it can be quite helpful as well, Steve. It keeps the
workload down.
Yeah. Michele, did you want to come in about work at the Royal Veterinary College or other experiences?
Yeah, thank you. It's not so much about assessment redesign, I suppose, where we're at, because we're a little bit still thinking about that. We've done it in a very limited way, but what we are really trying to do is influence student behavior in different ways. So we're looking at implementing a contract between the tutor and the student to sort of really think about how that influences their preparation for an assessment. And the thinking behind that was we wanted to have the students think about how they potentially used AI as part of their preparation in the early stages of their of the preparation for an assessment, rather than using it and then just acknowledging they've used it at a later stage. So we've got that approach, the contract. And then the other is as part of our sort of continuous assessment and using a portfolio approach and various tasks students need to complete within a portfolio. We're building tasks that relate to specific assessments to sort of say, okay, in this assessment, you're asked to do X, Y, and Z, and this might be ways you could use AI to support you to do that, but these are the things you need to be careful about. So sort of linking it to specific behavior that we've seen to be problematic with particular assessment types. It may mean then that we change some of those assessments in the fullness of time. But I think as an interim step, because we have seen so many problems, you know, with students maybe not realizing AI hallucinates some input that they find, for example, we wanted to take these steps in the immediate while we consider the bigger picture around assessment redesign.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, these are really good examples, aren't they, of building. I think the advantage to taking that approach to scaffolding the entrance into an assessment for students by it supports academic integrity, but it also supports student success, because it's really creating that environment, and it's actually much more real world relevant as well, because inevitably in the real world you don't just do your project output by sitting in a room for 3 hours and writing it all down. You build up to it and you prepare for it. So I think that building in those kind of time management strategies and those processes are so important. And I think, you know, this idea of focusing on the process rather than the product seems to be a very useful way of mitigating perhaps against inappropriate use of AI. Now we've got there's some good chat going on in the discussion area, and some conversations around the idea of large student cohorts and oral assessments and so on. So Steve and Stylianos are both putting some things in there, and we've also got some useful links. And Rosa has asked a question here, Steve, that you might want to respond to. With interactive oral assessments, how are the questions managed? Are the candidates each asked different questions, for example?
Yeah, good question.
You can come back. Yeah,
there are different ways to do this. So when you're starting to do it at scale, you'd normally ask the student to talk to a piece of work. So it'd be so it's not a kind of quizzing. It's actually a conversation that you start with the student, and you draw out their thinking around the piece of work they've done. So less around a question bank that you're then applying to the student to test knowledge, more around a conversation around a particular piece of work that they've submitted. So you're really testing their understanding of what they think they've submitted. You'd also see that happen when you may have a suspected academic integrity breach. You would say, can you come into the room and have a little bit of a conversation with me about what you've just submitted? Can you talk about your thought processes? So it's that kind of interaction around a particular piece of work. And I'll put a few links in for everybody, as well as a video from Griffith University and a couple of kind of outlines to that, to show how it scales, because scale is a big question for this.
Absolutely, thank you. Lynn has put some comments about the two-lane assessment approach, and I think that's really helpful. And Steve himself gave a webinar for code just a couple of weeks ago. So what we'll do is we'll add that into the chat, the link to Steve's recording which is on our YouTube channel. So we've got a question from Anna. Yeah, that's quite interesting, Anna. So the idea of doing stages, which I think builds on Michele's suggestion here. So we've got individual research, critical synthesis, and shared deliverable for peer assessment using rubrics. So peer assessment being a helpful approach there. I think with some of our assignments, as Alan Tait mentioned, you know, for the University of London, we have some really large numbers on a module. We might have 4,000 or 5,000 students, for example, taking an undergraduate laws module. And so managing several stages and peer interaction can be very challenging, but it is where we hope that AI will be able to help us in managing some of that complexity. Yeah, Anna, it's interesting that you said that students like peer assessment. I have actually found that some of our students don't like peer assessment. They would much rather, and we have another project that's been looking into peer assessment, and we found that actually that students are concerned that there's not a level of fairness, that the other students are not able to evaluate effectively. So it's really interesting, this perception of peer assessment. So I think it's a good discussion to have. But you've got 450 students on your course, so there's plenty there. We've got some great conversation going on in the chat. What we'll do is we'll make sure that we capture the chat and include that in the report, so that we've got, obviously we'll remove names and so on, but we'll capture things like links, etc., that we can have in the report that comes with the event. So I think we'll probably have to come to the end of this now. It's been really interesting. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for your engagement as the audience, and thank you also to our team who've done this research project. I'll make sure that everybody has the link to where the research project report is, which has some really detailed findings. And very challenging for our sector, but excellent to know that we're investigating it, and there's some really good thinking happening. Thanks very much, Stylianos, Alan, Steve, and Michele, and thanks to our audience, and thanks very much to the technical team for supporting this event. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.